In this session, we're going to address one of the great moral crises of our time. That is, the devastation to civilians who are engulfed in protracted violent conflict. It's important to know, basically, the scale of violence that occurs worldwide. By one estimation, 137,000 people die every year in conflict. That is, at least between the years of 1985 and 1994. Another study showed that that figure is much higher, as much as 378,000 total fatalities in war, again, within that period of time. And among the war dead, civilians basically represent a higher rate of casualties than do militants. They suffer a greater degree of devastation than do combatants. The figures are really quite stunning. In World War I, approximately 10% of the total war deaths were civilians. World War II, that figure rose to 50% of total war deaths. And today, the figure is as high as 75%, which means that for every one combatant who is killed in war, there are 3 civilian non-combatants who suffer. This according to the United Nations. Of course, that figure can be higher, it can be lower, but that, I think, is a reasonable average globally of civilian devastation. And of course, many people protest and find this situation, of course, morally abhorrent. Here we have Costa Rican women carrying a banner demanding that violence stop in that country. So we might ask, why have the laws of war and the international community, why have they not been more effective in preventing civilian devastation? Well, of course, there are very detailed laws of war that come from different sources. The Hague Conventions regulate warfare. There are conventions from 1949 which established laws to protect civilian non-combatants. And then the Geneva Conventions of 1977 basically identify various categories of participants of war who need protection. That is, civilians, prisoners, the sick, and the wounded. Now, regarding international law, there are 3 principles for the just conduct of militants in war. There are 3 principles under the realm called jus in bello. This is the area of international humanitarian law dealing with the just conduct of combatants. So the first principle is that of military necessity. This principle authorizes the use of armed force only against valid military objectives, valid targets. And these objectives are defined by those objects, whether it be human or material, which would offer a definite military advantage. And so, on this principle, civilian non-combatants, of course, are not legitimate military objects. The second principle within this area of jus in bello is the principle of distinction. This ensures that military forces direct their assault against legitimate targets. And, of course, it requires that each side identify itself through markings. That is, military objectives must be distinguished from non-military objectives. Now, the problem with this principle is certainly graphically evident, that the landscape of war in recent times, especially war involving non-state actors or these amorphous militia groups, it basically is this basically involves the groups intentionally violating the principle of distinction, making it extremely difficult for the soldiers of state-run military to identify the enemy. So in Iraq War II, Allied soldiers basically had extreme difficulty in identifying who, what, how, and from where the enemy is unleashing its force, that the insurgents intentionally blended in seamlessly in civilian life. One soldier just remarks in frustration, "They all look Arab. They all have beards, facial hair. Honestly, it'll be like walking into China and trying to tell who's in the Communist Party and who's not. It's impossible," according to this soldier. The third principle of jus in bello is called the principle of proportionality. And this holds that the morally good effects of a military action must be balanced proportionally against the morally bad effects. So it obligates a military commander to calculate the degree of damage for a military action, calculate this in advance, the degree of damage to non-combatants versus the degree of military advantage that would be achieved. So as presumably, on this principle, a military commander cannot order his or her troops to engage in an action that would lead to excessive civilian casualties. And that really is a huge question. What counts as excessive? How to apply the principle of proportionality is a question that has been raised by many, many people. What exactly is a proper balance between the good and bad effects of a military action? What is the proper ratio for proportionate killing? If you kill one civilian to two enemy casualties, is that appropriate? Or is it 1-to-1? Or should we average it as some number, 2.53 to 1? I'm just raising this as a question because it turns out that there doesn't seem to be any reasonable way to measure the advantage from destroying an enemy tank, for example, against injuring the disadvantage or loss from a child's death. And so, as a result, what has happened is that international humanitarian law has failed to protect the civilian non-combatants from the disastrous effects of war, especially effects of those wars involving state military and non-state militia groups.